Dr. Головнин is with us again. Mikhail Yuryevich Головnin, the first deputy director of the institute. He's corresponding member of Russian Academy of Sciences since 2016, if I'm not mistaken. He's a doctor of economics, professor at the Department of General Economics Theory of the Moscow School of Economics of the Lomonosov Moscow State University. Okay, I would like to give a floor to Mr. Головнин.
Thank you very much. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
And can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So my report will be devoted to monetary policy in Central and Eastern European countries. But from the beginning, I would say that by Central and Eastern European countries, I will mean both Central and Southern Eastern European countries, which are meant in in the name of our conference. So by external shocks, I will focus on probably three major shocks, starting from global economic and financial crisis impact on this region. After that, European debt crisis. Dates of European debt crisis are more or less not stable. They are dependent on a country, but anyway, we should focus that this was the continuation of a global economic and financial crisis, and the final year is the revival of economic growth in whole EU. And finally, our current external shock connected with COVID-19 pandemics. So if we look at the results of economic performance, which were partly already presented by Dr. Havlik at the beginning of our conference, but I focus only on the period since global economic and financial crisis, and afterwards. Not all countries are presented here because not all of them will be visible on one graph. But anyway, again, we can see probably the same result. I mean, more or less convergence path, but of course there are outliers like Poland, which is always a leader in economic development, and for example Croatia, which was for a long period under the average line. So if we look, for example, at financial development indicators, again, not all countries are presented here, but we have data for 5 countries on domestic credit to private sector in percents of GDP, and we can see here the rather famous thesis from economic literature about so-called creditless recovery in the region after the global economic and financial crisis. So in most countries, we saw at least stable or even accelerating path of banking sector credit developments. There was some growth trends in Poland or in Czech Republic, but again, we are in more or less similar level. So again, we saw some kind of convergence according to this indicator. And let's turn to monetary policy regimes in CE countries during this period. If we took a picture at current date, we can point out actually three main group of countries. Countries which have already become a member of Euro area. We are now 5, and we have already seen the dates of their entrance. In the middle, we can see 2 groups of countries included in exchange rate targeting, but currency board, I cannot say this is strict exchange rate targeting because there are little scope for monetary policy independence in this group of countries, and rather hard pegs. Sorry, this is This is the old name, of course, North Macedonia. Yes, and two countries with rather hard pegs characterized by exchange rate targeting. And inflation targeters, which are now the largest group, and during the period before the global economic crisis, all these countries have introduced this regime from, for example, Czech Republic in late 90s until Balkan countries in the beginning of the new century. So if we look, for example, at the dynamics of real exchange rate during this period, we can see that although there are some fluctuations which were connected, of course, with global economic and financial crisis impact in late 2008 and early 2009, the depreciation of national currencies, and also some depreciation trends during the European financial crisis, and afterward were also appreciation trends. But anyway, we can point out that the fluctuations of exchange rates in this group of countries is not so high, and we can conclude that practically all countries, not only, for example, Bulgaria, which is exactly following the nominal euro exchange rate and the inflation level of this country, but also other countries, even including inflation targeters, were putting rather much emphasis on exchange rate regulation. And this is also important for the region. And if we focus on the results of different kinds of regimes which I have mentioned, I calculated just simple averages for each regime. Each point was one country, 1 year. One country with visa-wet regime and the year of performance. So I divided the whole period on two subsets. The first subset, which we can call a so-called crisis period, from global economic and financial crisis to European debt crisis. So years are from 2008 to 2013. And after that, I will show the so-called post-crisis or inter-crisis, if we took into account global pandemics period of 2014-2019. So if we look at the performance of different group of countries, we can see that in the crisis period, the best results, for example, from the point of view of economic dynamics, of GDP dynamics, was shown by those countries which were already Euro area members. And after them were following inflation targeters. And finally, the least group with the worst results were exchange rate targeters. Both exchange rate pegs and currency board countries showed close results. If you look at the inflation average rate, this is rather interesting. This is not also the result for this period and previous period. I received similar results, that inflation targets in countries which actually should focus on inflation show us the highest inflation rate. It seems that the important determinant of inflation rate in this group of countries is exchange rate, and that's why, for example, for those countries which regulate exchange rates, or of course which are members of Euro area, for them the exchange rate is given, and there's some kind of nominal convergence. So we can see that for this group of countries, the inflation rate is low. And other interesting results is current account dynamics. Because again, if we look from the point of view of theory, inflation targeting countries should be more flexible and should show, how to say, better results from point of view of balancing external trade. And the opposite should be true for exchange rate targeters. But we can see that the situation is vice versa, and the best results were shown by Euro area members, and the highest level of imbalances are among inflation targeting countries. How situation have changed after the crisis period? Again, we can see that the best results were shown by Euro area countries, but during this period, inflation targeters have overcome them. This is rather similar with the results before global economic crisis, but during that time, exchange rate targeters performed better. In the current situation, they were again at the bottom of the list, and again, practically the same results as in previous period were shown with inflation rate. Again, the inflation targeting countries showed the highest inflation rate, but we should take into account that during this period there were many deflation episodes, and of course this deflation had influenced the inflation rate, and of course it does not mean that lower inflation rate is better, because of course we know from economic theory that deflation is the same evil or even worse evil than inflation. And again, the same situation with current account balance, which is more so-called, where external trade was more balanced during this period, but again, the higher amount of current account, negative current account balance was in inflation targeting countries, while, for example, in Euro area members, we can see the positive current account balance. If we look at the measures which were undertaken from the point of view of monetary policy, of course, mainly if we are talking about interest rate policy, we mean, first of all, inflation targeting countries, because those countries which are Euro area members, for them, the monetary policy of ECB is just given, and we are just experiencing the external effects of this monetary policy. For those countries which are exchange rate targeters, usually the interest rate is not an active instrument of monetary policy. If we look at inflation targeters, we can see the trend towards against converging the nominal interest rates of central banks. But of course, we should take into account that the variance of inflation rates could be higher, and that's why I have a look on real central bank interest rate. So because we have taken the interest rate at the end of the year, so I have taken the inflation rate at the end of period, annual inflation rate. And from this point of view, we can see much more variation in real interest rates. And what is interesting is the shift towards from real, positive real interest rates. It's in some time rather high, like for example in Serbia or in North Macedonia during the global crisis, to lower and for most countries negative real interest rates of central bank during the previous year. For example, only Serbia again and North Macedonia had positive real interest rates, but in both countries they were below 2%. So the level of accommodativeness of monetary policy was rather high during this period. For example, in Czech Republic, practically all the period the real interest rate of the central bank was negative. But again, it influences the current trend, of course, of interest rate. For example, in some countries, like Czech Republics, partly, for example, Romania, or during the years preceding COVID-19 crisis, we saw an upward trend in interest rates of the central bank. Besides ECB policy, which was rather constant because ECB was continuing in quantitative easing policy during all this period. If we turn to other monetary policy instruments, of course, we should again point out the focus on exchange rate regulation. For example, for Czech Republic, there was a period of several years until 2018 when there was actual double targeting, when they use exchange rate floor, and within inflation targeting framework, there was a explicit exchange rate targeting because this floor was officially proclaimed. There was so-called safe financing program in Hungary. It looked like some kind of quantitative easing policy because it was connected with the purchases of government bonds, but the main focus of this program was not on monetary easing, but on change from foreign currency denominated bonds to local currency denominated. So that's why I put it in exchange rate regulation set of instruments. Of course, there were some specific instruments on providing liquidity. They were mainly implemented before that during global economic and financial crisis. But a little bit later, I will focus on current crisis and show the changing situation. South and Eastern European countries were the main examples of countries which implemented so-called macroprudential measures. First of all, because before the global economic crisis, because of high rates of development of different banking markets, first of all, household lending. So they somehow tried to contain the rapid growth of bank credit. But even after global economic crisis, they used some of them used some specific macroprudential measures, first of all aimed at so-called de-Euroization of their economies. These were mainly Serbia and Croatia, which are characterized by rather high level of Euroization of their economies. So in these countries, macroprudential measures after the global economic crisis were set mainly in order to shift to instruments of denominated in national currencies. And finally, if we look at current crisis and trying to see how central banks react to this crisis, of course, we can see, like in many other emerging market countries, the path towards decreasing policy rates. And from the previous graph on nominal interest rates, we can see that there were, of course, the room for maneuver for decreasing the interest rates in these countries, and this was so-called the first line of defense, but also some countries broadened their monetary policy set of instruments, and it is interesting that in these countries were introduced so-called quantitative easing programs, mostly in Poland, Hungary, in Romania, but they in some countries they were rather limited because for these countries there was a very important also shift towards exchange rate, and that's why they cannot afford the full-fledged quantitative easing programs, because they will be influencing not mainly inflation rate, because inflation rate now is not such a big problem, but they will be influencing exchange rate. That's why, for example, Romania used rather contained quantitative easing program. And that's why, for example, in Czech Republic, this program was announced, but was not in place at least till summer. There were also some specific programs, for example, small and medium enterprises loan support or corporate-based program in Hungary. So again, they implemented some specific measures, some measures on exchange rate support here. Just the example of Romania is presented, but as I have already said, of course, actually almost all Central and Eastern European countries implement some measures to support exchange rates. So what could be the conclusions? If we look at the distribution of countries according to monetary policy regimes, we can see that again, and this was the case in previous years, two sets of monetary policy regimes were established. One of them is inflation targeting, and it now prevails in the region, and the other one is exchange rate targeting, which was actually diminishing because, for example, 3 Baltic countries, among them 2 were implemented currency boards, and 1 Latvia hard peg. They are now euro area members, so we can see some kind of rise in inflation targeting group, and those countries are not hurrying up entering the euro area. And we saw the diminishing of the group of exchange rate targeters because they are of course among leaders entering the euro area, because this is not so hard for them, because they just simply do not reject the autonomous monetary policy. And we can see that euro area members actually perform rather well during both periods, during the crisis and after crisis, and that exchange rate targeting countries are now in probably the worst position. So that's why they should be, from that point of view, interested in entering the euro area as fast as possible. But again, even if we look at inflation targeting countries, we can point out that the regulation of exchange rate is important for those countries, especially for countries with less developed financial system, like, for example, Romania, Serbia, Albania, and so on. And of course, we can see that during COVID-19 crisis, new monetary policy instruments appeared. Of course, they were connected with the policy of European Central Bank, but not the same amount, because the quantitative easing programs of ECB are quite large, not like in CE countries. But anyway, this is very interesting how these developments would be in the future. So would it be some kind of new instruments for CE countries, or they would be just rejected after crisis will be over? So thank you very much, and I will be grateful for questions and comments. Thank you.
Mikhail Юрьевич,